Well, there could be different interpretations, and obviously, I don't know what goes on inside the White House. But one interpretation is, of course, that the United States is doing this right now for the sake of Israel, for the Israeli regime, because Ansarullah said that as long as the regime continues to impose a blockade and prevent, or a siege and prevent medicine and food and water from getting into Gaza, they will reimpose the siege on the Israeli regime. So if the Israeli regime continues to implement the agreement for which the United States is a guarantor, and Trump was behind the agreement, if the regime in Tel Aviv were to implement it, then Ansarullah or the Yemeni armed forces would not have made this move. So I think it's easy, one could say that Trump wants to help the Israeli regime impose this siege, impose starvation on women and children, in the hope of getting more concessions from the Palestinians, and that what Ansarullah is doing is that it's putting pressure on the Israeli regime, but also it makes the American camp look bad. Remember, all the countries in the region are in the American camp, basically, more or less, and all of the events over the last year and a half have been chipping away at their legitimacy in the eyes of the public. I mean, many of them were never legitimate, but in any case, it makes them look even less legitimate. Even Turkey, which is more democratic than the rest, it is seen as completely hypocritical. It does business. Erdogan does business with the Israeli regime. He transports oil, and he even helps them gain access to goods that cannot be accessed because of the blockade in the Red Sea. That's what he's been doing for a year and a half. Jordan, people are outraged by what's been going on. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, across Egypt, of course, across the Arab world, these countries are all, and beyond, the countries are seen as complicit. And then when Ansarullah stands up against the Israeli regime to protect starving Palestinians, it makes them look worse, and it makes people more look with admiration increasingly at Ansarullah. So I think Trump is trying to help the Israeli regime enforce that siege on women and children. Also, I think it may have something to do with what's going on in Ukraine. I'm of the view that there will probably be peace in Ukraine ultimately. It will not be as swift as some had hoped. It will probably happen though, but it's complicated. And as your audience knows, because you have better guests than I, and your audience, they are very politically aware, President Putin does not need a ceasefire. In fact, if many of us were in his place right now, they would be seeking to push forward to get what they want, because they have the upper hand and the other side is falling apart. And so are there, and those who've been backing the Kiev regime, they're also at each other's throats. The United States divide with Europe and so on. All of that we're seeing playing. That weakens the morale of the Ukrainian army itself when they see how things are going around them. So I think Trump will have to make concessions to the Russians, and in order not to look weak, this helps. He can behave like a murderous monster, which he is, and people in the United States, or at least many people in the United States, will see him as a strong president, especially the very same people who think that Christ supports genocide in Palestine. But I think it benefits him. It's sort of like the whole, Canada and Greenland and the Panama Canal rhetoric. It makes him look strong in the eyes of his base and his supporters. And I think bombing Yemen, bombing countries always does good for U.S. presidents. It always it pushes up their approval numbers. And if you recall, the first time that he bombed Syria, even his opponents spoke about how he finally became the president of the United States. It was at the beginning of the Russiagate affair, but when he bombed Syria, this man of peace, everyone, the mainstream media, and they all rallied around him. So I think Yemen makes him look good in the eyes of many. Of course, in the eyes of the world, he looks like a murderous monster. But I don't think that his priority is not an international audience. It's the American people that he's looking at. So I think these are the two major issues. But one thing that we have to keep in mind, these are two interpretations that I can think of. One thing that I think is we can add to that is that this is in order to weaken the axis of resistance. But I think that is definitely a part of it. But I think that is a part of a broader picture. In other words, I think it goes along with other things, but it is definitely there. In other words, I think he wants to seem strong if he has to back down on Ukraine, and he wants to help Netanyahu to put pressure on the Palestinian people, the people in Gaza. But then there's this broader objective to weaken the axis of resistance. He thinks, my understanding is that many in the West seem to think that the axis of resistance has been broken and that it is weak. And that if he can break the people of Yemen now, then the Israeli regime will reign supreme in that part of the region. I don't think that is as I've said before, I don't think that's an accurate analysis. I don't think Hezbollah and Hamas are, comparatively speaking, have been weakened compared to the Israeli regime. In war, everyone is weakened. The Russians have been definitely weakened. They've lost men, they've lost money, they've lost equipment. Everyone loses something in war. Hezbollah definitely lost in manpower and equipment. Hamas did too. And then, of course, the massacre of civilians in Lebanon, the targeting of civilians in Gaza, that's a loss too. But comparatively speaking, the resistance in Lebanon and in Gaza, I don't believe they lost. I think they won because the Israeli regime, relatively speaking, is weaker. How is it weaker? It has been exposed in the eyes of the world as a ethno-supremacist regime that is ugly, that is immoral, its very existence is immoral. And it's become like apartheid South Africa during the last years as people became more aware of what it was. Until now, that was not the case. The media was able to present the Israeli regime as a democracy, as a beacon of hope, and an extension of the free world in this barbaric, Middle East full of these Muslims and people like me. But that's not the case anymore. You see, even in the West, people are sympathizing with the Palestinians, with the Lebanese. Hezbollah has become popular. Hamas has become a household name. Ansarullah in this region has become, they were despised 2 years ago simply because the whole Arabic media was against them, whether it was Al Jazeera or Al Arabiya or anyone else. But now public opinion holds them in high esteem, even though the Arabic media still tries to speak against them. Al Jazeera Arabic right now is trying to ignore the fact that as much as possible. That the reason why the Americans are bombing is because they're supporting Palestinians. They don't want even Al Jazeera doesn't want to show Yemen as the supporting power behind the people of Gaza, partially because Doha Qatar, along with Bahrain and the UAE, were used by the Americans in this attack, and so was Saudi airspace. So I don't think that they've been weakened compared to the Israeli regime, but they do seem to think that way. That's been what we constantly hear in the West, just like we've been hearing about Russia for almost 3 years, that Russia was losing the war, that they were, using washing machines and dishwashing machines and taking out the chips to fight the war and that sort of nonsense. But now we've seen that the reality is different from what we've been told. So I think that this is a broader project, a part of a broader project to destroy the resistance and, of course, to weaken Iran, which lies at the heart of the resistance. Well, before I respond to that, which is a very good point, I should point out that his threats against Iran are not going to deter the country. And the leader has already twice in the last few days basically warned the Americans about Iran's strength. The Americans, Trump knows that if he strikes at Iran, that he's going to receive punishment, and that the leader said that they will be on the losing end. They will receive more punishment than they hand out. And it also shows that many people like to say, especially those who've done nothing for the resistance, who've done nothing for Gaza, they like to say that Iran's not doing anything, but Trump is basically admitting that Iran is helping Yemen. Iran is, just as Iran has been helping Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, and the resistance, the whole resistance. So, I think that's something that some of these people should take note of, whereas their countries or their governments continue to do business as usual with the Israeli regime. The Iranians are paying a price. They're being threatened. They're funding the resistance, and they're sanctioned as a result of it. But Iran's not going to be deterred. And you rightly point out that this is not new. The Americans have been engaging in genocide in Yemen for a decade now. They helped the Saudi and the Emirati regimes initiate a genocidal war in Yemen that lasted for 7 years. The Americans helped establish a hunger siege in the Red Sea, very similar to what we have in Gaza. They would prevent food from getting it to Yemen, to northern Yemen, in order to put pressure on the people of Yemen. The Canadians, the British, the French, all of them were helping the Saudis and the Emirati Air Force, the Air Force of the two states, to constantly bomb Yemen. So Yemen survived 7 years of genocide with really endless money being put into it by the Saudis and the Emiratis. They use up a lot of their reserves in this genocidal war, and the media was supporting the genocide collectively. Back at the beginning, the Erdogan and Qatar supported the Saudi and Emirati war. It was only later when relations between Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Qatar broke down that Qatar tilted away and Al Jazeera took a different tone. But Yemen then survived this. They became, over the 7 years, they became increasingly powerful. At the end, they started striking Saudi oil installations. And the Saudis haven't yet fully recovered, as far as I know, from those attacks. Even today, Saudi production, oil production has been hampered because of. Yes, but it is quite striking that, for example, Qatar, which uses Al Jazeera on the one hand to support the people of Gaza, at least with propaganda, but on the other hand support ISIS and Al Qaeda and the genocide in Syria. But here, Al Jazeera doesn't say anything about the role that Qatar, its government, plays in carrying out airstrikes on Yemen. which, again, I think it just shows the nature of Qatar and the nature of these regimes who pretend to be supportive of the Palestinian people. But in any case, Yemen has survived 7 years of genocide, and the Saudis and the Emiratis had to back down. And then they willingly went to support the Palestinian people. We all know that they blocked the Red Sea first to put pressure on the Israeli regime to end the genocide. They said, we're implementing the Genocide Convention. So basically what we have today is a repeat of what we had a year and a half ago, and the same logic. Yemen wants to stop the genocide, and I should praise them for that. And the Americans are insisting in supporting the genocide, whether it's Biden or Trump. So as many of us have said many times before, there is no difference between Biden and Trump when it comes to our part of the world and when it comes to much of American foreign policy. But in our part of the world, there's no difference. They support genocide, they support terror, they support extremism, and it is all for the sake of the Israeli regime. It is literally almost all for the sake of the Israeli regime. They are sacrificing their own interests because Europe obviously has sacrificed its own interests by destroying Libya. You have this huge influx of refugees coming from Africa. By destroying Syria, you have a huge influx of, or Iraq, you have this huge influx of people coming from West Asia into Europe, and that has caused huge tensions inside Europe. And many, of course, in Europe are blaming these refugees, whereas they should be blaming their own governments for destroying the lives of these refugees in their communities, in their cities, in their countries. But the West is making these sacrifices for the sake of Israel. But the fact remains that Trump's policies and Biden's policies are not far apart. The tactics may be different. Trump, he supported a ceasefire, but in the implementation of the ceasefire, as it was being implemented, he said that the Palestinians must leave Gaza. Not even Biden said that. So you can't, those who are telling us or trying to sell us the idea that Trump is a peacemaker, I just find them to be, well, since some of them are my friends, I would say badly mistaken, but except for my friends, I'd say they're completely delusional. Well, there is a big difference between Hezbollah, the situation for Hezbollah, and the situation for Hamas. I've said this before. Hamas and its allies like Islamic Jihad, they had the luxury of being fully in control of inside Gaza. Right? Hezbollah never had that luxury. Hezbollah, although more powerful than Hamas and Islamic Jihad combined, but they live in a country where you have 40 Western embassies, non-Western embassies that are client regimes of the United States, all NATO countries, regional countries, the Turkish embassy, even a couple of embassies that I don't want to name, besides the usual suspects. Muslim countries, and I don't mean Arab countries, I mean non-Arab countries that are deeply involved in intelligence gathering for Israel, for the Israeli regime. Then you have all these NGOs, USAID that we've heard a lot about these days, or NED and others, NED. The United States has been spending more money in Lebanon and the Europeans than in any other country, when you look at the population. So Hezbollah has always been surrounded, and they're always under threat. There's always intelligence gathering, Western intelligence agencies, regional intelligence agencies, all of them working to gather information and to use it against Hezbollah. And then they use their allies inside Lebanon, like the fascist group, the Lebanese forces, and others, to threaten Hezbollah. The same people who carried out the Sabra Shatila massacre in 1982 when the Israeli regime took Beirut. These people went into the refugee camp and murdered 3,500 innocent people in 36 hours under Israeli supervision. These are Western allies in Lebanon. So Hezbollah has that big disadvantage. And then, of course, the Israelis and Netanyahu and Erdogan and Biden conspired to undermine Syria, which is a different story. Although I would like to add one footnote, and that is that I don't want to name names because I don't want to make things complicated, but Syria is becoming very complicated some of us predicted. It's becoming increasingly worse for Turkey and Qatar. The country is really falling apart, and so is the economy. And countries in the region that are hostile towards Turkey and Qatar, they're increasingly concerned. And I'd like to point out that the fighting that took place before the genocide on the coast, before the genocide, there was fighting where militant groups rose up against these ISIS and Al-Qaeda forces. An Arab country was behind it. I'm not going to name country, but an Arab country was behind it. But in any case, in Yemen is different. Yemen has the advantage that Hamas had, in that it controls that territory. It controls most of Yemen. It controls the whole north of Yemen, and especially the mountain. These are mountainous areas, which make it very difficult for the Americans and the enemies of Ansar Allah to wage war against them. They're in full control, so they cannot easily be infiltrated. Two, the area is much larger and the population is much bigger. So for the Americans to be able to infiltrate, for them to be able to discover assets, what assets exist, and so on, is much more difficult. Three, Yemen has had a decade of bombings. First the Saudis, and then a year and a half the Americans and the British and the Israelis, right? So they've already taken everything that they have underground. They've been doing that this whole decade because if they don't, they'd have already been destroyed. So all of their key assets are deep underground, much more so than Hezbollah or even Hamas, because they've been constantly bombed during this decade. So it is going to be, I think, literally impossible for the Americans to defeat them. It is going to be costly for the Americans. It is going to, again, destroy their destroyed image further. It is going to make the resistance more popular. It is going to make those who are complicit look more complicit. So Yemen, I think, is going to be able to resist. And Trump does not have any special card under his sleeve, as I may have said before, that Biden didn't have. It's not as if like he has some new special weapon or he has some special power that was not accessible to Biden before. Biden constantly bombed Yemen. The Israeli regime bombed Yemen. And the Saudis bombed Yemen day and night. And so did the Emiratis. So I think that Trump will not succeed. He will fail. But later on, he'll find a way just to pretend that he was victorious. I think and his supporters are. He once said if he shoot, I think in 2015 or 16, he once if I shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, I'd still be elected, something like that. His supporters would still back him. He does have that. He does have those supporters. And so if he says later on that yes, we defeated them and they're crushed, then his base will say he did. But it is useful for him now if he wants to give concessions to the Russians, then he can be tough here and kill innocent people here and say, look how tough I am, and then that way maybe he can more easily give those concessions to the Russians. Definitely, we're going to see an intensification of bombings in Yemen based on what he's saying, because if he doesn't do it, it will be a major back down. But it can't be more intense than the Saudis. It can't be more intense than what the Saudis and the Emiratis did. They carried out 7 years of genocidal war. They used hundreds of billions of dollars, the Saudis, from their reserves to constantly bomb Yemen day and night. There wasn't like one operation or one series. It was done all day, every day. And the Saudis, they had a lot of money to waste. And now they're wasting the rest of it with NEOM and all these other crazy projects, but that's for a different day. So I don't think it's going to be costly for the United States. And for Yemen, it's their home turf. For the United States, it's a big logistical problem carrying out each and every one of these attacks. These aircraft carriers cost a lot to keep in the Red Sea, and so do all these ships. And then all these planes coming back and forth. And again, there's the issue of credibility. This does not look good at all for Qatar or for the Emirates or Bahrain or Saudi Arabia, or even those which are directly involved in these or indirectly involved in these airstrikes. But even other countries that continue to remain silent as the people of Gaza are being starved. Because people are looking, they know why, even though, as I said, Al Jazeera is trying to, Al Jazeera Arabic at least. I don't watch Al Jazeera or any news channel really, but Al Jazeera Arabic, from what I've been told over the last few hours, they've been trying to talk about the airstrikes, but not to link it to Gaza. But people link it to Gaza. People know that this is about Gaza. They know that the people of Yemen are being killed because they're saying we have to stop the genocide. And this is not something lost upon many people in the West as well. The tables have turned, Danny. The tables have turned. People, and I say this, it's anecdotal, but I do feel this. For decades, the West has been able to successfully demonize Iran. Iran has always been evil. Hezbollah, to a lesser degree. I mean, some people did like Hezbollah, but Iran was really evil. Ansarullah was disliked a lot, as I said, because the media completely against Ansarullah. Today, that whole narrative against Iran, I'm not saying the whole thing has collapsed, but it has been badly battered. And Iran has become very popular. I get messages every day, or I meet people who from different countries, or I speak to people in different parts of the world, and they say everyone literally, that I'm in contact with, says that the mood has changed across the world. Now people are looking to Iran or to the resistance for hope, and they dislike the United States, whether it's Biden or Trump. And I think this is something that the Americans don't appreciate. This is not good for the United States, and it's not good for its client regimes in the region. And the continuation of this, who knows? Maybe nothing will happen. But when we had the so-called Arab Spring or the awakening, no one thought anything was well. I guess most people, almost no one thought anything was going to happen, and then all these countries fell apart or their regimes collapsed. And we have to remember that Jake Sullivan, just 2 weeks before October the 7th, said that the Middle East, as he calls it, I would call it West Asia, North Africa, but the Middle East is, I think he said something like it's in one its most, it's in one of the best situations that it's been for many years. And literally a few days later, we had Hamas attack Israeli positions alongside the Gaza Strip. So these actions by the United States are costly. They make it more despised, and it weakens its allies, and it strengthens the resistance. It makes the resistance more popular. I don't think anything will change. I think you're correct. If your viewers recall, it was just a couple of weeks ago when Trump said he's going to destroy Hamas, and if they don't release the prisoners, or the hostages as he calls them, by Saturday noon or something, that all hell will break loose. And what happened? Nothing. He didn't do anything. because he's not capable of destroying Hamas, and he's not capable of destroying Islamic Jihad, and he's not capable of destroying Hezbollah, and he's obviously not capable of destroying Ansarullah. But this is, I think, this is just how the United States works. Part of this is also, by the way, the military-industrial complex. This money has to be spent. These missiles that are used, because they're going to be using very expensive missiles to bring down Ansarullah drones, cheap Ansarullah drones. They're going to be using very expensive missiles to bring down very cheap Ansarullah missiles. So this is going to be very costly, not just the logistical aspect, bringing in aircraft carriers and naval ships and airplanes and jets, but also bringing down or attempting to bring down missiles and drones. It's going to be very costly for the United States. But that is what I think that's part of what all these wars are about. It is about Netanyahu, as all of these wars in the region have been pushed by the Israeli regime, including the dirty war in Syria. And those who participated or supported the dirty war in Syria basically were, some wittingly and many unwittingly, they were supporting the Israeli regime. Those who now support Julani, throughout this period they've been supporting the Israeli regime. Many made a lot of money out of it. Those who worked in these think tanks, or those who were funded by NED or USAID, these Syrian so-called opposition people, and others. Many were just fooled, ordinary people who were fooled by the narrative, and who were pushed towards sectarianism and so on, that sort of thing. But they've been basically helping the Israeli regime during this whole period of time. Nevertheless, I think that this is not going to end well for the United States. As I said, it's going to be very expensive. It's not going to succeed. And I think that ultimately, after many people die and after much suffering, the United States is going to probably quietly back off. And we have to keep in mind that, by the way, in a totally unrelated topic, that every day, Danny, every day, the Israelis are murdering Palestinians. Every single day. And the Americans are the guarantor of the ceasefire. Every day. Some days they're killing 10. I think yesterday they killed 11 Palestinians, including 2 reporters. And every day they're killing people in Lebanon. I think in the last 24 hours they murdered 3 people. And in the West Bank, it's, 1 every day or 2. And this is all done amid Western media silence. It's done with the consent of the West, because they're the guarantors for the ceasefire, but they allow them to do so. So there is no ceasefire in Gaza. There's a starvation siege going on that's been going on for 2 weeks. You don't hear it in the Western media. They don't report it. Literally starving 2 million people in Gaza, but they won't say anything about it. And regular killings. And Ansarullah is saying, stop killing these people, stop starving these people, implement the ceasefire that you are the guarantor for. And for that, Ansarullah is being bombed. Yemen is being bombed. And what are they bombing? There is no infrastructure. The West and the Saudis and the Emiratis have destroyed Yemeni infrastructure already. They've bombed the country for a decade. There is no infrastructure. It's an impoverished country. But the people have very strong feelings for the Palestinians. They are humane and they are resistant. And those assets that they do have to help the Palestinians, those military assets, are, as I said, underground.
I'm sorry, hold on. Oh no. Oh fuck.
What happened?
I can't get.
Well, the United States does not have overwhelming force as it as it used to have a couple of decades ago. And Ansar Allah's assets, I don't know if how long we got cut off, or if we got cut off or not, but Ansar Allah's assets are all underground. It's not accessible to the United States, and the country is huge. This is not Gaza, and it's not Lebanon. The area is controlled by Ansar Allah. They are the government, and it is mountainous, and they have their assets are deep underground. And obviously, they are getting assistance from Iran. Iran does not hide that, but also the people of Yemen are very sophisticated. They have smart people. They if they're taught how to make missiles, they'll learn how to make missiles. If they tell them, if they're taught how to improve those missiles, they'll improve those missiles, despite the poverty, despite a decade of genocidal war imposed by the West on Ansar Allah and the people of Yemen. They are very sophisticated. They have surface-to-air weapons. They've brought down they have brought down a $500 million worth of American drones. That's a very sophisticated air defense system. They have surface to sea missiles. They have surface to surface missiles. They have drones. They have these weapons are made in Yemen. They've been taught how to make them. They've been given the technology, but they're capable of using it despite the circumstances. So the Americans this is going to be very costly for them. Whether the aircraft carriers hit or not, the amount of money that the Americans are going to have to spend to defend those aircraft carriers and naval ships is huge. And remember, they lost what was it, an F-18 that was shot down by one of their own. They claimed was shot down by one of their own missiles a few months back during the later days of Biden. During the clashes that were going on between Ansar Allah, or the Yemeni armed forces, and the U.S. So this is just going to, I think, it's going to be humiliating for Trump. But when it comes to our region, corporate media is with Trump. When it comes to Israel, when it comes to killing Muslims or brown people or Christians from our part of the region, they've shown no sympathy for Christians in our region. They destroyed the Christian population in Iraq. They've destroyed much of the Christian population in Syria. They've forced they've allowed the Israelis to basically expel most Christians from Palestine. They have no sympathy for our part of the world, for anyone really. So I'm quite confident that Trump will not be able to succeed in Yemen, and Yemen is going to become just more popular. One of the interesting things about this war, and war is horrible, but and I don't mean the war in Iraq was Saddam Hussein was a monster, but the Americans, they supported him and then they turned against him. So even though the U.S. war wasn't legitimate, but Saddam Hussein was not a good guy. The war in Afghanistan, the war in Libya, the same. It was not legitimate. But this is a war about one side wanting to stop a genocide and the other side insisting to support a genocide. This is, even Ukraine, while I sympathize with the Russians, I don't, the Americans carried out a coup, they lied and expanded NATO. I don't have sympathy for NATO or the United States anywhere on this planet. But in the case of Yemen, or Lebanon for that sake, Hezbollah supporting and sacrificing for Yemen, for Gaza, this is a war about one side opposing genocide and the other side insisting on carrying out or supporting genocide. So it's unbelievable. I think the region is in a very dangerous situation because a lot of what's happening is driven by internal Israeli politics. and Netanyahu's own troubles inside Palestine. And because of that, I think these wars came about. Before the war in Lebanon, I was telling people that I think that there will be war because he has to have war. And then Syria, I think the same. I don't think Syria is going to end well for Israel. I don't think it's going to end well for Turkey or Qatar either. Even though Israel and the Americans and the Israelis definitely want to Balkanize Syria, but I don't think it's. I don't think they'll. I don't think they'll succeed. But Turkey getting a part of Syria and the Israelis getting another part. In the long run, I don't think that's going to work. I don't think anything that he's done over the past year and a half has been good for Israel. They can, just like in Ukraine, they can pretend that they won the war and say, "Oh, Hezbollah has been crushed and Hamas has been crushed and Ansarullah has been crushed. Everyone's been crushed, and Iran has no weapons. Iran is defenseless." They can say that, but it's just like in Russia. They said that for 3 years, and now look at the situation in Ukraine today. So Netanyahu may need war, and if he ultimately decides to do something, then the situation will escalate. If he attacks Iran, it is going to change the situation dramatically. And if the United States attacks Iran, the leader has said that Iran will strike back at the United States, and he said that Iran will hurt the United States more than the United States hurts Iran. And remember, this is not U.S. turf. This is just like in Ukraine. The advantage was with Russia. Why? Because Ukraine borders Russia. The United States, its aid has to go across the ocean, across Europe to get to Ukraine. That's a costly war. The war in Iraq, a lot of it, the expenses were because of the very fact that they had to move everything from the United States to Iraq or other bases to Iraq. The same was true in Afghanistan. In West Asia, the same is true. The United States has to bring in its military. It has to bring in more ammunition. And all of this is going to be very costly, and it's going to be a burden for the United States. And for Iran, it's much more easy to defend itself. It's much more easy for Yemen to defend itself. It's much more easy for the resistance to defend itself because it's their turf. And then in addition to that, the whole Persian Gulf region is full of glass palaces and glass houses. It's full of oil and gas installations and desalination plants and tankers and petrochemical plants. If there is war, all of these will just disappear. They won't be able, they will not be able to use them anymore. And that will bring down the global economy. And you know what the situation is right now. Many people in our part of the world don't appreciate what's going on in the United States, what's going on in Canada, what's going on in Europe with regards to the economy. Many people here still think that the Europe and the United States are some utopia where people are living the good life and life is very easy. The circumstances are not good for most people in the West. And if this happens, their economies would collapse. And then if the global economy collapses, what do people think is going to happen with immigration? Is it going to decrease or is it going to increase? It will increase tenfold. If you have large numbers of people moving from Latin America to the United States, if the economy collapses, well, it's going to collapse everywhere. And so the places that are worse off, they're still going to be moving towards that land of hope or opportunity, even though it's an illusion. And the same is true in our part of the world. The consequences of war in our region are immense and they are mind-boggling. And it's really something that's impossible for me to imagine. So I think the Americans don't want war. I think that it's not a good thing for the Israelis to have war, but Netanyahu wants to remain in power at all costs, and that is what could bring about war. I think the important thing that we should remember is that this situation that we have today is very different from what we had during the first Trump presidency. The United States is not the United States of that period, and the rest of the world is not the same. Much has changed. China is more immune to US sanctions and tariffs because they've been antagonized over these 8 years. So China is less vulnerable than it was back then, and therefore in a stronger position than it was back then. Russia, we all know how different things are today. It is much less vulnerable because the West has used all of the weapons at its disposal. It no longer has leverage. They can pretend to do sanctions more, just like with Iran. You have the same with Iran. Iran has the sanctions we have maximum pressure sanctions right now. They've never been removed. Biden never removed any sanctions. So Trump's room for maneuver is much more limited. These countries are less vulnerable. The United States and the West are more divided and much weaker because of the economy, because of the endless wars, because of the war in Ukraine, because of the genocide in Gaza. So Trump it doesn't have the sort of, this is not the same world that we're living in today as 7-8 years ago, or even 4 years ago. So I think it's going to be much more difficult for Trump to behave like he did back then. Even back then, he had no real success. He never undermined Russia, he never undermined Iran, he never undermined China. But I think his ability to hurt is going to be more limited, and the United States is more vulnerable. And there's a lot of talk about an economic crisis in the United States approaching. I'm not an economist, I can't comment, but the situation is not good. And the tariff wars, the United States is in conflict with a host of other entities, unlike back then during the first Trump years. So I think it's going to be much more difficult for Trump to behave like he did before. He wasn't successful back then. He's definitely not going to be successful now. Trump and the United States, the political establishment is united against Iran because of Israel. Otherwise, as I said a bit earlier, this region, if it wasn't for the Israeli regime, this region would have had very good relations with the West. Business and trade would have been normal. You wouldn't have these millions of refugees in Europe. No one wants to leave their homes. So, but because of the Israeli regime, and that's why I always say that the existence of this regime is, morality aside, it just shows the West to be completely immoral, but it is detrimental to Western interests. It is a burden to the West, a big burden. And we're seeing that play out. So I don't believe that Trump has the ability. I think there are probably a lot of people in the military who are telling Trump, don't pick a fight with Iran. But nothing is impossible. And the leader said Iran will strike back very hard and make sure that the Americans are hurt more than the Iranians. And we always have to keep in mind that Netanyahu is a desperate person, and he is willing to do anything to stay in power, being seen across the world. And U.S. universities are going to lose a lot of customers. A lot of people will probably think twice about sending their kids to the United States because they could get into trouble, or they could get expelled, or they could get punished. I mean, if I was in the United States, I'd probably be sent to Guantanamo Bay with my political views. So imagine how many people think, and again, this is just another I mean, this is something that Biden did as well. That he quelled the student protests. Many of them Jews. We should always remember that, but who were protesting. But Trump has intensified this, and this again is damaging the United States immensely. The United States can no longer pretend, even though I never believed it, and many others never believed it. But no one believes that this is the free world, or the United States believes in, or the Europeans believe in freedom and democracy. They're just exposing themselves as they decline. They are finding it more difficult to keep on the mask. Look at what happened in Romania, and look at what's happening, with regards to foreign students in the United States, or the arrests and harassments of journalists in Europe, who are not even being arrested because of internal dissent. They're being arrested because they're protesting about what's happening in Palestine. They're not even protesting about their government, doing injustice at home. They're saying this other regime where we shouldn't be supporting it, them carry out genocide, and they're being arrested and they're being suppressed. And this is all of this has brought the empire. It has brought it down. Basically, its soft power has crashed and been destroyed, but the hard power of the empire, I think, is crumbling. Yes, and also one other thing, and that is Syria. Syria, what we've seen in Syria has vindicated the resistance. Many people who are now opposed to U.S. policy in Syria and opposed to what's going on in Syria, a decade ago thought very differently. Many of my friends, many of our mutual friends, their views have evolved because they've seen the reality of what's going on. A lot has been exposed, and the genocide that took place on the coast, I think, opened the eyes of those who are willing to have their eyes open. So this does not look good for the West, and even Vance is sort of admitting in a way that just a couple of days ago about how the West has been, and one thing that how they've been supporting these extremists. But one thing that I'd like your viewers always to remember, that these are not Islamic terrorists. These are not Islamic extremists. These are creations of the CIA. These are creations of Western intelligence agencies. They have nothing to do with Islam. Just like the Nazis have nothing to do with Christianity, or Zionism has nothing to do with the Judaism of people like, our friends at Electronic Intifada, or the Gray Zone, or all the other good people who are doing really good work against Zionism. Those people, we have many friends, both of us, who are Jews, who have nothing to do with Zionism. So these extremists, these terrorists have nothing to do with Islam. In fact, before the dirty war in Afghanistan, which Brzezinski and Carter, the so-called human rights president, before they initiated this whole process of weaponizing this small extremist ideology of Wahhabism that was in Saudi Arabia, we didn't have this sort of problem across the region. The region wasn't a utopia, but the very fact that in Syria and Iraq, you had different people, in Iran, you had different people from different religions, and in Afghanistan, and different ethnic groups living together, not always necessarily peacefully, but they did exist. But now we see things have changed because of the slaughter and the massacres that have taken place by these groups that were created by the CIA. That sadly, Erdogan and Qatar and oil and gas, other oil-rich countries in the Persian Gulf, and the Israeli regime, of course, that they've been supporting for these 40-some years, this has created all this devastation. The same people who carried out 9/11 were the people who the Americans funded in Afghanistan. And then after 9/11, they began funding them again in Libya and in Syria, and so on. So, to call them Islamic terrorists, they're not indigenous to. This is not Sunni Islam. This is not Islam at all. This is something that intelligence agencies have created, and their client regimes in the region spent many, many, many tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars, to promote them in uh, in line with Western policy, to use them in Central Asia, to use them against Iran, to use them against Russia, to use them against China, to use them against whoever they want to bring down. So this is something that I really insist upon, that this has nothing to do with the Islam that we know. This is American Islam. This is meaning Western, CIA Islam. This is British Islam, meaning intelligence agency, but it's not our Islam. Our
Yeah.
Islam is against the genocide. Our Islam is the Islam of Ansarullah, the Islam that where they or the Islam of Hezbollah, where they sacrifice themselves to protect the Palestinian people. Our Islam has the same views as in many ways as all those young Jews in the United States who are arrested for protesting against or who were harassed or who were punished because, or Christians or others who were protesting against the genocide. We're against the genocide. That I think is the number one issue in the world that we live in today. One side is pro-genocide and one side is anti-genocide. One side is fighting to commit genocide and the other side is fighting to stop the genocide. It's as simple as that. Some of them are carrying arms and they are the axis of resistance. Others are a part of the broader resistance, and they exist in countries across the world where they protest, where they boycott, and I think they should boycott American goods now, but where they protest and boycott and do what they can do to create awareness. I know many will not agree with me, and but this is my view. And that is that the axis of resistance and the broader resistance have won already because they are on the moral side. Some people say politics is all is completely immoral. I don't believe that. I believe that all those people who protest on the streets, all those people who boycott, all those people who stand against, they are political and they're moral. You can pursue national interests, you can pursue interests and also have morality. This is something that the West always pretends to do, but it's the exact opposite, the collective West, the regimes in power. But the axis of resistance has won the war. Hezbollah, they sacrificed their kids to fight to save, to spare Palestinian children, to spare them in this genocide. Mothers and wives sent their husbands and sons to fight and be killed, be martyred, to protect the Gazans. The same is true with Ansarullah. The same is true with those students who've been kicked out of university, whether it's in Columbia or somewhere else, because they took a moral stand. They've already won. And the side that supports genocide, they've lost. They've already lost. The Israeli regime may be around for a few more years, but it's already dead. And their supporters are exposed. They can continue to gain support among those cult members who believe again that Christ supports genocide somehow in Palestine. I think these are enemies of Christianity who put Christ in such a whose frame he would be be supporting the oppressed or Moses or the Prophet Muhammad, ISIS and Al Qaeda. These are the enemies of Christianity. These are the enemies of Judaism. These are the enemies of Islam. I think that they've already lost. And the collective West, the empire, they've lost in the eyes of the world. They've been exposed, and they have been exposed to many of their own people, not just for what they've done in our region, not just for the stupid war in Ukraine, but also now for what's going on in Europe, the injustices, the accumulation of wealth by a few, the subsidizing of the rich, and the disenfranchisement of the poor. People's eyes are open. So I think that, and I believe in moral victories, and I think moral victories count for a lot. That's why life I think is worth living.